The first reading today, we hear Job in the midst of his struggles asking the question, is not man's life on earth a drudgery? Are not his days those of hirelings? Like a slave who longs for the shade and a hireling who waits for his wages. You have to ask yourself, does that sound like something that you would say? It's so easy just to get on the gerbil wheel and we just go round and round and round, and every day is like the one before, and it's just frustrating and it's empty and what good is it, and so on. And we can see obviously the disposition that Job has, certainly one of someone who's suffering, but it's not a real good disposition at this point. But it's not unlike the disposition of an awful lot of people in our country. And so it's something then that we need to be able to look at and ask the question, what is it that we do to make that change? Because it's a relatively simple change, actually. Just a change in our disposition will make all the difference in the world. But it's not an easy change to make. So we look at what St. Paul then talks about in the second reading. And he talks about how he has an obligation that has been put on him, an obligation to preach the gospel. Woe to him if he doesn't. But he says, though, however, that he has chosen to do this in a different way. That is, that he has made himself the slave of all. That's where the difference is. Now, that doesn't sound like a good thing to most of us, and if we just think about it how we think of a slave in America, it's not good. But that's not what St. Paul's talking about. He's talking about making a free choice to make himself the servant of everyone out of charity. That is something absolutely every one of us can do. It's not easy because, as we've talked about many times, we live in the most selfish society in the history of the world, and to practice charity, to truly love, is the opposite of selfishness. So it's having to learn to die to self. It's having to learn to seek the good of the other, to put the others first. But in case you might sit back and think it's just not possible, for those of you who are married and have a family, may I remind you that that's exactly what you do every day, especially if you have young kids. You have made yourself the slave of these children. Not in a negative way. Might feel that way sometimes. Life is just a drudgery, right? It's only a drudgery if you're doing it only out of a sense of obligation. If you're doing it out of love, there's no drudgery. You're still having to do the exact same things, but your disposition is entirely different because you're doing it purely out of charity for the other. And so nothing might change as far as the externals go, but the interior is entirely different. And that goes across the board. For those who are married, this should be the easiest and most natural thing in the world for you because you've actually made a vow that you're going to love this other person. But as I've told you before, you make a vow to love that one other person because some days that one person is going to be the most difficult person in the world to love. You didn't have to make a vow to love everybody else. They're a whole lot easier. But are you doing that? How many marriages have just sort of settled into a routine where it's just tolerating one another at best? Some marriages are not very good at all. And the reason why they're not good is because they're not loving one another. They're not truly seeking the good of the other. They're not dying to the self in order to live for the other, as they have promised to do. And so you realize that for those who are married, or for those of us who are ordained, there is an obligation that's there. An obligation that we have freely chosen. No one forced you to say that you're going to love this other person for the rest of your life. You did that freely. Now there's an obligation to do it. Now you can look at it as an obligation, and therefore it's a drudgery, and I have to do this stuff. But then it's not being done out of love. You're just doing your duty as an obligation. Think of it from a priest's perspective. I could have gotten up this morning and said, I have to go and preach again today to those people. Or I can say, out of love for God and out of love for the souls entrusted to my care, I want to preach the gospel to them because I love these people and I want what's best for them. Either way, I've got to preach. But I suspect if it was just a matter of drudgery, if I didn't really want to do it, it'd be pretty obvious, wouldn't it? The tone wouldn't sound too exciting. Of course, it might not to you anyway, but nonetheless, it'd be pretty obvious. It's like, oh, he's just going through the motions. He doesn't really want to be here. He's not preaching this because he really believes it and because he really loves God and loves us. He's just doing this because he has to. See, that's the same thing. Whether it's in your marriage, whether it's at work, whether it's with your kids, or for the kids, whether that's toward your mom and dad, or whether that's toward your brothers and sisters. If you're doing something because you're forced to do it, you don't want to do it. You might do it because you have to, but you don't want to. If you're doing something out of love, even if it's not what you would personally prefer to be doing, you're doing it for the right reason and with the right disposition. And you can even rejoice in doing it even though it's difficult, even though it might be unpleasant. You see, just that one little change on the inside changes literally everything. And it is doing exactly what Saint Therese told us that we should be doing. Her little way, which, remember, when Saint Therese was canonized, the Pope said she was the greatest saint in modern times. And that's because she made the way of holiness accessible to everyone. And what was it? Do small things, do ordinary things with extraordinary love. Just that simple. Do ordinary things with extraordinary love. So if you have to go to work to support your family, are you just on the gerbil wheel? Do you hate it? Do you you hate it, but you have to pay the bills and so you have to go to work? Or are you doing this for your family? Because you love these people, and if you're in a supervisory position, are you doing it for the good of the people underneath you? Again, you can do this as a power thing. I am the supervisor and I have power over you. Or you can do it out of charity. I have authority to serve you. Now, you still have to be the supervisor. You still have to call them to task and so on, but your disposition is entirely different. And then your paycheck isn't just simply for the sake of paying the bills. Your paycheck is because you are serving your family. You're serving these people whom you love. And that's what it's all about. The same is true if you look at yourself and see something like Job. Maybe God has allowed you to carry a pretty heavy cross, and there's a lot of suffering involved in it. And you lay awake at night suffering, and the night drags on, and then you get up the next day and it's just more of the same. And it can be very, very difficult. But if you can unite that with the suffering of the Lord, if you can offer that for a specific reason, now you have a purpose. Suddenly something that seems so negative and so difficult and so drudgery suddenly becomes something positive. because I can do something good for someone else with this suffering. For parents, if your children aren't yet in their vocation and they're trying to discern it, maybe that's part of why God's allowing that. Certainly He's going to use it to purify you and help you to grow in holiness, but it might be to help your children. Or if your children are in their vocation and maybe they're struggling, you can offer it for them. Or just look around the church and the world. I mean, there is no shortage of things you can offer your suffering for. So find something that's important to you, that's meaningful to you. I mean, traditionally, parents have said, offer it for the souls in purgatory. What a wonderful thing. But maybe purgatory isn't a big deal to you, or you don't think about it. And so it's like, yeah, I guess I could do that. No, find something that's important to you. So then you've got a real reason for wanting to do this, a reason that's important to you, so that you can make something good out of something that doesn't look good. When we look again at our blessed Lord in the gospel, He goes into Capernaum and He goes to St. Peter's house. They point out that St. Peter's mother-in-law is sick. Jesus heals her. Small town, doesn't take long for word to get around. Pretty soon the entire town is at the door. Everyone who's sick, everyone who's possessed. Now Jesus could have looked at it all and said, oh my goodness, I can't handle this. He didn't. He healed them all. Then He could have sat back and said, everybody thinks I'm pretty cool. I'll just stay right here in Capernaum. They'll make me the king. I can be the mayor of the town. The people all can look at him and go, wow, we got a wonder worker here. This is cool. He's right in our town. We don't want him to go anywhere. But what's He do? He says, no, that's not why I came. I came to preach the gospel to everybody else. That's what we're going to do. So what has God asked of you? If He's called you to be married, that wasn't just a generic call to say, okay, now get married, now just live it out in the natural way. He's called you to be married, and He's continuing to call you in that state to be able to grow. And He's giving you the grace to do it. But we have to be willing to cooperate. So if you're in a troubled marriage, are you actually willing to love this person? That is what you made a promise to do. Are you willing to do it? I don't mean have gushy feelings about the person. I mean die to yourself and serve that person. Are you willing to make yourself the slave of all to save at least some, as St. Paul talked about? See, again, you can just tolerate the situation that you're in, and what good is that going to do? You're going to be frustrated, you're going to be angry, you're going to be miserable, or you can change your disposition, and you can love. And if you can love, you can be at peace. You can find fulfillment. You can even find joy in the midst of it all, because you have a purpose. And the purpose is the very purpose for which you were created, so therefore it's the one that's going to fulfill you. So if you're finding life a drudgery, days like those of a hireling, then recognize what's going on. That means I'm focused on myself. I'm not loving God and loving neighbor. I'm just looking at me, and I'm miserable. And how could we not be if all we're doing is looking at ourselves? So if that's what you're seeing, just make that one change. Take up the attitude of St. Paul, which of course is the attitude of Jesus. It's that of charity. Place yourself at the service of others. Truly do everything out of love, and you will see that everything in your life will be able to change for the good. Maybe all the things on the natural will still look the same, but for you it will be entirely different. It's no longer just the gerbil wheel. It's no longer just a drudgery. Because there's purpose, because there's fulfillment, because you have brought charity, the love of God and love of neighbor, into a situation. And that love not only transforms the whole situation, but it transforms you, and it helps you to grow in holiness. Again, this can't be done by yourself, only with the help of God, so you need to be praying. And if there's somebody, again, if it's a troubled marriage, if there's difficulty at work, if there are problems with the neighbors, whatever, pray for those people by name. Bring the charity into the whole situation. The greatest work of charity is prayer. So again, you're not just being asked to do this by yourself, you're being asked to do it with the help of God. And if you're willing to do what God has asked you to do, you can do it because it's an obligation, or you can do it because of love. It is only love that is going to transform everything. That's our call as Christian people. That's our call as human beings. That is what God wants for every one of us. And every one of us is absolutely capable of doing this. The question has to do, are we willing? But if we are willing to say yes and bring that to prayer, God will give you the grace to be able to change that disposition and do exactly what St. John of the Cross said, where there is not love, bring love, and there will be love. You have the ability to do that. And with that love, to transform and change everything by that one simple change in your own disposition.